Hi, my name is Karolyn Coffey, and I'm part of a grant project that focused on creating a unit using the C3 framework. For my unit, I chose to focus on kind of the history of housing segregation from the perspective of the 1940s and 1950s to current day. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm just going to show snippets of this unit. Now, this unit can be incorporated as a standalone, but it can also be used, like pieces of it can be used in other units. So if you were focusing on life in America during World War II in the 1940s and housing issues that took place there, especially among people that were working in the war industries, you could use parts of this unit. If you're talking about the 1950s and civil rights movement, you could definitely use parts of this unit, and even more modern day history units. If you wanted to focus even on something like the Great Recession, there are pieces of this unit that would also completely be relevant to those conversations. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share the PowerPoint that lays out the entire unit. Give me a moment. And pull this up. Okay. So my first compelling question is a bit provocative. Who is most culpable for creating segregated communities in post-war America? And this is a very big question. Often, particularly when we're talking about segregation in the North, and I actually have an excerpt from our own district U.S. history book that describes segregation in the North, particularly along de facto segregation, meaning that people, for the most part, chose to live in segregated communities that just out of personal prejudices and preferences, people chose to live apart, and they prefer to live with their own kind. We know that peeling back the history of segregation in housing is a lot more complicated than just people's preferences and individual prejudices. So I think that this question is important because in order to understand why even today, when we look at maps, why we have segregated communities and all of the problems that follow with segregated communities, we get to understand that it is more than just people's individual choices, that there were other factors at play that created these communities. And so to begin with, I would like to pose the question to students, really kind of tapping into what our traditional definition of the American dream is and how that's connected with home ownership. Often when we ask students, when we get to the 1950s and this concept of the American dream is promoted through television, through advertisement, as something that you acquire through hard work, right? That like, so long as you work hard, you can get that big house. Maybe that American dream and that success is also symbolized in having that nuclear family, the mom, the dad, the 2 or 3 kids, and a dog named Spot, right? And that is an actualization of the hard work, that meritocracy. If you just put enough hard work into things, anybody can achieve that. But we know, again, that the story is much more complicated than just working hard. And so I would start this lesson, again, just creating that classroom definition of the American dream. And often when I've done this, you can use something like word art. You come up with these kinds of key words or key concepts. And I would say that people or students often will say that big house, right, is often something that symbolizes the American dream. Like you have arrived because you have this awesome home that's in the suburbs and in the zip code that everybody knows is connected with the good schools, the low crime, and that all that is part of the American dream, for right or for wrong. And so coming up with that working class definition, that class definition of the American dream would kind of be a way to kick off this unit for me. And that even today, we still are really obsessed, right, with like home ownership, and that this represents what it means to be successful. Again, for right or for wrong, that typically is a traditional working definition, or at least is associated or a piece of that American dream. And so I have this video here. It's only like a 2-minute video that, again, is an obvious, it's from the 1950s of the kind of concept of, what it looks like to kind of have arrived, right? To have that house in the suburbs. This video touches upon the newly developed Levittown houses, the sprawling suburbs, and what that looks like. And after watching that video, I think that that's an important conversation to have with the students. Like, what did they see? What people were moving into these homes? What seemed to be accessible to only certain types of people? It could also lead into a conversation about what the suburbs solve with regards to housing shortages or overcramped lifestyles in the cities. And talking about what the positives and negatives were to living in a place like Levittown for some people. Several graphs here that represent just the increase of home ownership after World War II. And then there's a primary source analysis. This is Franklin Roosevelt's 1944 address to Congress, where he lays out his vision for this second Bill of Rights. And within this address, he touches upon the importance of home ownership. This idea that, in order to avoid another Great Depression, Americans need to be invested into this economy, and having home ownership is a way to accomplish that. Not only do you build equity in your home, when you own your home, you can pass on that wealth to your kids. You can withdraw off of that equity, put your kids through college, and that this kind of economic ladder, so to speak, is created through home ownership. And so things like the GI Bill made it much easier for veterans to coming home from World War II to participate in home ownership programs. There was an expansion of the FHA that allowed people who previously had rented homes now with very little money down, with very low interest rates. Now, many Americans are able to afford homes, not just the affluent. And again, we know that that's not the entire story, right? Not everybody was able to participate in those FHA programs. And even if you were a veteran returning from the war, frequently, if you were African American, you were denied access to getting an FHA loan. And so there's this article analysis that I created, a really good article that came from the History Channel that really talks about how the GI Bill was denied to African American veterans. And so that kind of sums up just the first part of this unit. And instead of students doing a culminating essay, I just broke it up into these quick writes where students would reflect on this first section of the unit in 5 to 6 sentences, answering the supporting question, how did home ownership come to symbolize the 1950s American dream, and was it successful to all Americans? So students can write in just their regular US history notebook if they have that. Maybe you use an electronic notebook for your class, or maybe you have a discussion board. And then they post that on something like Canvas or whatever learning management system your district uses. So the next supporting question is for kids to describe historic roots of housing segregation that arose from New Deal policies and how this discrimination was perpetuated in the suburbs. And in order to do this, students will be using a variety of primary sources and filling out something called the spec chart. So the spec chart has all of these social, political, economic, and cultural factors that students will consider. So you would kind of kick this part of the unit off by first introducing the spec chart and using the GI Bill as an example. Students can write in here like kind of a definition or a brief explanation of what the GI Bill is, and then explain whether or not the GI Bill was a social, political, economic, or cultural factor that led to housing segregation. Okay, let me go back to the PowerPoint there. So this will be a chart that will be used throughout the remainder of the unit, and students will add to that chart. I also have here a spec reference page that students can rely on. So if they're not quite sure, I don't know, is this an example of a social factor or political factor, they can use this reference sheet to kind of determine which factor is best applies to either that action, that person, that agency that will be reviewed within the unit on housing segregation. It's important at this time then to go over and review with kids the difference between de jure and de facto segregation. And often, particularly in our history book, de jure segregation is often regulated to the South, right? Those Jim Crow laws, the separate drinking fountains, the separate seats on the bus, the separate by law areas where African Americans live and where whites live. But then when we get to the North, I have this quote from our US history book. It says, the problem facing African Americans in the North was de facto segregation, segregation that exists by practice and custom. And this really kind of takes the federal government all the way down to the local government's actions kind of off the hook, because there are specific laws and specific actions that created in some neighborhoods that didn't even have segregation, but then implemented segregation through its practice. And so to just describe Northern racism and Northern prejudice as just de facto doesn't include the entire story, which again brings us back to that culminating question, right? Like, is there someone or something more specifically directly involved that had played a heavy hand in creating these segregated communities that we see even today? So kind of a review, I would assume that students at this point already were introduced to these concepts of de jure and de facto segregation, but certainly if not, this would be an appropriate time to teach what the differences are. Here's a great example, local example of the Detroit 8-mile wall, right? Where on one side of the wall, developers were given money by the federal government to build, or backed up mortgages money to build white communities. And on the other side of that wall was housing just for African Americans. That is not an example of de facto segregation. That is a factor of de jure segregation. A lot of information in this unit was inspired through this book, The Color of Law. And I found off of the Teaching with Tolerance website some excerpts that come directly from this book. Richard Rothstein did an amazing job of really laying out the case for the federal government, in particular, its responsibility for creating housing segregation really around the United States through redlining, through FHA mortgages, and in a lot of regards, supporting racial covenants. And so this excerpt begins with describing, first and foremost, the role of the PWA and its hand in building segregated communities. And so students will get some background information on that. And then I have a specific example of how the PWA built a community in Detroit called the Sojourner Truth Housing Project. And this was a housing project that was for African American war industry workers. This is in the 1940s. And once African Americans started to move into this housing development, there was a large group of white homeowners who lived kind of on the other side of the area and rioted against the moving in of African Americans in the community, believing that as more African Americans moved into this area, their housing prices would plummet, and that this was an economic threat, as well as other, racial stereotypes and prejudices against African Americans. So this is just a hometown example of how these things kind of played out and the riot that ensued. And with this activity, students are able to look at actual photographs of the riots that took place in front of the Sojourner Truth housing projects, but then they can also kind of scroll back and see what that area looks like today. So it's a pretty interesting view in that regards. And then there's information about what happens below, and students can complete a photo analysis on any of the photos on the Sojourner Truth riot. There was another suggestion that I had, that they could also create a historical marker. What would be appropriate to put in this spot today if they were given the commission to do so? What would be most appropriate to memorialize what had happened here? Eventually, African Americans were able to move in to this area, but again, we had to have the call of the National Guard come in, escort these families into these homes. I have some examples on housing segregation, or just kind of like the overall feel about racism during this time period. Both of these are from Langston Hughes, from Beaumont to Detroit, and of course, the What Happens to a Dream Deferred. So students can do a poetry analysis. It's related to the topic. And then I have clipped in here a YouTube video that again goes into a little bit more detail about housing discrimination and its connection with New Deal policies. And all of this information students can then, again, to help process through either as a class or individual activity, use their spec chart to then determine how each of these things contributed to housing segregation. Were these political factors? Were they social factors, cultural, or economic factors? So this video talks about the HOLC that is responsible for redlining, the FHA, the government-backed mortgages, redlining, the PWA, and racial covenants. And the video is only about 8 minutes long. Mapping Inequality is a great website to demonstrate redlining and what that looks like. You have an opportunity here to explain to students what all of those colors look like. So if you lived in these red areas, it was considered hazardous. The yellow areas, definitely declining. The blue areas still desirable, and the A were the best areas. And these maps come from the 1940s, but it's interesting and later on the unit to compare these maps to what communities look like today in 2021. We still see the clustering of certain races living in certain areas, and kind of, as we know today, what parts of Detroit suffer economically, may have higher crime rates than where we see white people living, perhaps like in Grosse Pointe, still a very desirable area, still is known as very wealthy. And so these clusterings of people are still very prevalent when we look at maps today, which is very interesting, I think, for students. This section also goes over the history of Levittown, and William Levitt's hand in promoting racial covenants, making sure that these new sprawling suburbs were primarily reserved for white families. The FHA underwriting manual talks specifically about denying African Americans access to low interest FHA mortgages. The racial covenants, which prevented white people from selling their home to African Americans. Some of these covenants also identified Mexicans or Jews as being undesirable citizens to sell their homes to. And at times, even if a white family did want to sell their home to a minority group, they would often they could run the risk of being sued for violating these racial covenants, even after these racial covenants are found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. I have a specific example, 1957, of William and Daisy Myers, who are able to move into one of the Levittown suburbs. They actually buy their home from a Jewish family that's willing to sell them the home. They are horrifically terrorized by the white neighbors there for at least 9 days. There's a cross that's burned on their home. They are victims of horrific racial slurs, people gathering in front of their homes, blaring music at all times of the night. William Myers actually was a World War II veteran. Daisy Myers worked in the school system, you know, on face value, like just a regular good family, but victimized based on their race. There's a news report that took place on what happened in Levittown in 1957 that students can watch and listen to the reasons why. Some of them, thinking back, are comical, like this is some kind of like communist plot to destroy their community. But listening to the citizens themselves that live in Levittown as to why they believe that this Black family doesn't have a right to live there. But then there's also, I also found a primary source from the Library of Congress, an article that was written in that time period that was published in Look magazine. Oops, I'm doing a whole lot of stuff. That students can read and do an article analysis on the Myers family. But I think the most important activity within this section of the unit is the mixer activity. And this comes from a website called the Zinn Project Foundation. And what it is an attempt to really demonstrate just the sincere difficulties that African Americans had in trying to access these government programs that really seem to enrich and improve and uplift middle-class Americans. So everybody is assigned a particular role, and often the role that they receive is in fact a real person that lived during this time, the 1950s, and they are to kind of mix and mingle with each other. They're given a questionnaire sheet, so it kind of helps them guide the conversation and what they're looking for. And then it all ends in a culminating class discussion on what was learned, what was surprising. It helps them get familiar with the language of redlining, of blockbusting, about the FHA. So it gets them actively moving in the classroom, actively using the vocabulary that's part of housing discrimination, and kind of gets a feel of what types of frustrations people felt if they weren't white to get into suburban living. And again, this will be followed up by the last two excerpts from the book, The Color of Law, that just kind of reinforces those concepts from the mixer activity. The end of this section, again, just asks students to then think about, process all the information, and describe these social political factors that contribute to housing segregation in the cities and perpetuated in the suburbs. So we're going to bring it back to that supporting question, and students will answer this in 5 to 6 sentences again in their notebook using material from this section of the unit. The last supporting question is, what is the effect of housing discrimination, and is there evidence of it happening today? So there are some activities in here where, again, if you wanted to reference housing segregation in the present, maybe starting with the Fair Public Housing Act of 1968 and how this was an attempt to eliminate these types of practices with regards to housing, but yet how we still continue to have problems even after the passage of 1968. So if you wanted to talk about the Great Recession and how it disproportionately impacted people of color with regards to home foreclosures and how they were the victims more than any other group of subprime lending, predatory lending, you could use activities from this section of the unit. And I wanted to show particularly this racial dot map. And so this is a website that shows you the mapping of America, and you can look at specific cities and what their racial composition is. And so this is an activity where they would go, let's say, to Detroit, and they could take a look at how communities are organized today, and then use Google Maps to then compare using like Google Finder. You could look at those neighborhoods in real time. What do those neighborhoods look like versus other neighborhoods that are primarily white? What neighborhoods look like maybe there's better trash cleanup, maybe the streets look safer, maybe the houses are more upkept, and what reasons do we have for that? So it's a great inquiry lesson for students that's related to housing segregation. And again, going through all the material, then at the end, they would go ahead and answer the final supporting question here. Can we see the effects of housing discrimination today? So they would turn in, at the end of this, they would turn in all their quick writes. They would have that completed spec chart. They would turn in, obviously, the racial dot map activity and all the other activities that you may or may not have chosen. I did create a culminating activity that wasn't just a typified essay project, but something that I called a social justice activity using this application Wakelet. And so what this is like a platform that students can upload videos, tweets, they can upload their own PDFs, they can upload anything. And Wakelet is kind of like it's like a discussion board or a project board. And so they can organize all of these pieces of information around a singular topic. And so what I would like the students to do is to think about ways in which housing discrimination has maybe impacted other aspects of life, that maybe we can associate crime due to housing discrimination, school segregation, school inequity, environmental injustice, environmental pollution based around housing segregation, that all of these other issues are some way connected with housing segregation. And so there would be a conversation with students to kind of come up with issues that may have been kind of exacerbated as a result of housing segregation. And so students would create a 2 to 3 minute video describing their topic. And again, then all of this material would be placed on Wakelet, and that would be something that they could share with the teacher. They could share with other students. Other students can comment on their Wakelet boards. Maybe you would assign students pieces of each other's Wakelet board to assess and respond to. It's just a really great way to organize information. So after the video, students would also create just kind of a brief paragraph describing what the issue is using some references and properly putting them in MLA format, choosing some historic photographs that well capture their issue and creating captions to describe the importance of those photos, finding a map or a chart that highlights the issue. They could upload an article that discusses the issue, and then you would have students highlight the main facts of that article. Students could also upload media, artwork, or other social media like YouTube videos or Twitter posts, and then they would be responsible for responding to those things that they post, explaining why it's important, or maybe arguing that this piece does not accurately portray the issue, and kind of critiquing those works of art. And then I have students create a call to action page. And so this would be an infographic page that they would create using Canva. And a lot of this perhaps could come from specific organizations that are currently working on this issue. What are the solutions to this issue? And finally, I would ask students to create an important vocabulary page. So identifying words that in order to understand this issue, it's important to understand kind of the vocabulary that's often used when describing this issue. So specifically when we're talking about housing discrimination, things like redlining and blockbusting, not everybody may be familiar with what those terms are. So creating their own vocabulary list, at least 5 vocabulary terms that are relevant to their particular topic. And that would be it. Okay. So all of the links are going to be attached in the lesson plan and brief descriptions on how to use the material. Okay, thank you.